This is part 14 of what I said in chapter 6 of Gender and Development in Nigeria. And I will focus on how the Nigerian state's relationship with citizens shapes gender relations. So, focus is on shaping gender relations, the interplay between the Nigerian state and citizen security. So I talk in the chapter about how the Nigerian state's relationship with its citizens significantly shapes and reinforces existing gender inequalities. I argue that the state's failure to fulfill its responsibility of providing equitable security to all citizens creates a context where structural violence, which is a system of embedded inequalities that produces avoidable harm, becomes a defining feature of gender relations. This structural violence, the chapter says, manifests in numerous ways that directly and indirectly disadvantages women, limiting their opportunities, agency, and representation in Nigerian society. So I talk about three ways in the chapter. First is the unequal burden of insecurity. I talk about how the state's inability or unwillingness to provide consistent and equitable security for all citizens places a disproportionate burden on women. And I talk also about how the lack of adequate security measures, especially in the regions that are plagued by conflict and instability, like in the northeast of Nigeria, in north central Nigeria, and in even the northwest, as well as other hotspots in the country. In these regions, women and girls are exposed to a heightened risk of violence, including kidnappings, sexual assault, and forced recruitment by armed groups like Boko Haram. This insecurity, I emphasize, not only directly impacts women in terms of their physical safety, but it also restricts their mobility and limits their access to education and economic opportunities. It also reinforces their dependence on men for protection. Second is the reinforcement of patriarchal norms through state action and inaction. I argue that the state, through its actions and inactions, plays a crucial role in reinforcing patriarchal norms that further disadvantage women. I point to the state's failure to adequately address violence against women in politics and the continued existence of discriminatory laws and administrative practices that limit women's legal capacity and property rights, and then the lack of political will to implement existing gender equality policies as evidence of the state's complicity in maintaining a system that benefits from women's subordination. This failure to challenge patriarchal norms, I suggest, sends a clear message that violence against women is tolerated, that their rights are not fully recognized, and that their participation in public life is not a priority. Third, the case of the Chibok girls. I use this as a microcosm of structural violence, and I use this case to illustrate how the state's failure to provide security, particularly for marginalized groups and communities, has profound gendered implications. I detail how the initial slow and inadequate response of the Goodluck Jonathan administration to the abduction, along with the continued captivity of many of the girls, despite subsequent efforts, highlights the state's inability or unwillingness to protect those who are most vulnerable to violence and exploitation. The abduction, I argue, serves as a serious reminder of how structural violence operates. To create a hierarchy of security where those with power and resources are protected, while those on the margins, particularly women and girls, are left to bear the brunt of insecurity and its devastating consequences. I underscore that the Nigerian state's relationship with its citizens is not merely a matter of failing to provide security, but that this relationship is actually actively shaping gender relations in a way that reinforces existing inequalities. By neglecting its duty to provide equitable protection for all citizens, the Nigerian state perpetuates a system of structural violence that disproportionately impacts women, restricting their freedoms, limiting their opportunities, and undermining their full participation in Nigerian society.